Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. We'll give everyone a couple minutes. People are still coming in, and then we'll get going. All right, it looks like it's slowing down, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today for our webinar. 2022, is this the year of recovery? With economist Chris Kuehl from Armada Corporate Intelligence. A couple housekeeping tips as we get started. Please feel free to post questions in the chat. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session and we'll address those. And thank you also to those who submitted questions in advance. We got some really good ones. Definitely inflation is a theme. So not to be a spoiler, but Chris will address that and then we can talk about it more during Q&A. And as you heard, the session is being recorded and the recording will be shared with you after the session and available on our website. So just I wanted to get started with a poll just to see where you guys are at today. So we'd like to know what current economic challenges are impacting your company now. So you should be able to see the poll on your screen and you can select all that apply. So are you suffering from the workforce shortage, supply chain disruptions, increased demand, or anything else? And if it is something else, we'd love to hear about it. So go ahead and post it in the chat. And we'll give about a minute or so for the poll. Someone shared COVID outbreaks in facilities. Definitely, great point. Increased raw material and freight costs for sure. Receiving from customers and ordering needs to be digital process, raising fees. Vaccine mandates, yep. I heard there might be some news on that in the next week or so from the White House. So yeah, definitely an issue. All right, well, thank you everyone for participating in the poll. I'll go ahead and end it now and we can see the results. So we have 62% shared that workforce shortage is an issue for your company right now. 92% shared supply chain disruptions, 62% increased demand for your product, and then the other are also causing issues. So lots going on right now for sure, which means we're extra excited to hear from Chris and any insight he can share. All right. So now I would like to introduce Angelo Gangoni, our Executive Vice President, and Angelo will welcome us and introduce to Chris. Angelo, take it away. You're on mute right now.
I'll never get used to that mute thing. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Adria, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It was really interesting to see that increased demand is actually considered a challenge. I guess in today's world it is, but I don't know if you would put that in the category of good problems to have, possibly. But before we get started, I just want to let everybody know, as far as Chris goes, I first saw Chris actually doing a similar type of webinar for another association, another manufacturing association. And right away, I was extremely impressed with the information he had to share and how knowledgeable he was. Chris, as you mentioned, is the managing director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. And prior to that, He started it in 1999. Prior to that, he was a professor of economics and finance for 15 years. And I have to say, having had several discussions with Chris, it's amazing the amount of knowledge that he has. And in fact, when I first talked to him in one of these type of settings here on Zoom, I asked him if he was in a library. And what was really impressive, he said, no, that's my home. And he went on to tell me that he actually has a collection of 40,000 books, which was really mind-blowing, especially in today's world, when everybody's reading books on tablets anymore. But anyway, Chris also is the writer and editor of Business Intelligence Briefs and a writer for the Black Owl Report. Both publications are from Armada. And he's also an economic analyst for the Armada Strategic Intelligence System and is responsible for the Credit Managers Index from NACM, as well as Fibronomics from the FMA. So, Chris, I know people are really anxious to hear what you have to say about 2022 and the current state of the economy.
Very good. So, yes, a note on my book collection. It either indicates that I do a lot of reading or that I'm a dinosaur and haven't been able to figure out how to do the digital thing where I could put it all on a tablet and not have to have all these things. But you have to understand that I come from a long line of bibliophiles. My grandfather was one, my father was one, and in the pre-Google era, every little question that came up would send my dad and I into this flurry of searching through our library, trying to find references to back up whatever point we were trying to make. So now you just Google it and the end of the conversation is at hand. But back in the day, man, you had to spend hours going through all that stuff. So I'm going to get into the subject at hand rather quickly. This has been a nice experience because I've talked to you guys once before. I have to admit that what I really miss about doing this on a webinar basis as opposed to when I saw you all live is that I don't have the smell of wood to kind of create the ambiance. So I was almost tempted to go saw something just so there would be sawdust around. And webinars are a little bit unusual. We're getting used to them, of course, but the important thing is to interact as you get an opportunity to. So when you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat room and we'll talk about them later. But more importantly, if you have questions later, and everyone does, don't feel the least bit inhibited about sending me an email. I am just as long-winded in print as I am in public. So feel free to ask me anything. You can specific to your company or just some issue that came up because we obviously won't cover everything in the detail that it deserves in the hour that we have. So I couldn't resist this. You know, I don't always foul up while woodworking, but when I do, I call it rustic. Most of the stuff that I end up working on, it's kind of like, yeah, well, I had ambitions in the beginning, but it didn't quite work out as planned. If you look at the last couple of years, they're going to be anomalies forever. So being able to compare anything to 2020 or 2021 is going to be nearly impossible, particularly 20. So years from now, when people are looking at what happened in the past, they're going to have to put an asterisk next to 2020 because nothing in that year was remotely normal. It was even a weird recession. Recessions generally kind of announce themselves, they begin to develop over time, and frankly, companies have an opportunity to prepare. That didn't happen in 2020. I mean, it was just literally a recession via edict. We had not any experience with something like COVID-19. We didn't know what to do. We shut things down, not really understanding what that would mean or how long it would last or even if it would work. We really assumed that this was going to be a 1 or 2 month experience. We thought that we would have a May rebound. We would be back maybe by June at the latest. People weren't really being laid off. They were just being furloughed. Everything we thought we knew in 2020, we didn't know at all. So it ended up being a much worse year than we anticipated. 2021, we didn't really understand either because we thought that the growth would be relatively slow. that it would take a while for people to kind of get back to normal. That wasn't the case. I thought it was interesting that in the poll you just took that so many people were talking about demand, because that really has been the issue. Nobody expected the demand that they got at the beginning of this year. They haven't really expected the demand that they've gotten throughout the year. The supply chain crisis is partly due to inhibitions in the transportation sector and the impact of COVID and all that stuff, but a lot of it is just being overwhelmed by demand. In the second quarter of this year, we were growing for a period at around 9.5%. We never grow that fast. And even when we ratcheted it down by the end of the second quarter, it was still 6.5, which is ridiculously fast for a country this large. So that demand came surging into the market at a much more rapid clip than we thought it would. It has now since slowed down. The latest GDP numbers came out today, and we've really slowed down. We've gone from a 6.5% rate in the second quarter to 2% in third quarter. We knew it was going to come down. We didn't think it would come down quite that far. It's not catastrophic. We'll talk more about that in a minute, because we normally grow around 2.5% to 3%. So we're still within range of our normal growth. But if you look at the rest of the world, all of these countries are experiencing about the same thing at the same time. So looking at the good and the bad, and then we'll get into inflation in a little bit more detail. Again, growth was good at the beginning of the year. It has slowed down a lot since, and the rebound really got underway late spring, early summer, stalled a little bit, but seems to now be coming back. Retailers are reporting pretty decent numbers going into the holiday season. The service sector is still shaky, but it's picking up. Just in a very anecdotal assessment, I'm traveling again. Trade shows are back. They're about 70%, 80% of what they were, and beginning to pick up speed. But the airports are full, the planes are full. Flying is more miserable than it's ever been before, but it's back. Their leisure traveler is still planning a pretty solid holiday season. The only inhibition for the airlines right now are the business travelers. They're not back to their original numbers. The indicators in general have remained pretty strong. We'll talk about those in a minute. Inflation I'm going to get to in the next slide, but we're also dealing with workforce issues. I'll talk about that too. One of the challenges with the whole workforce conversation, and I was talking to Angela and Adria a minute ago before we started, the press drives me insane because they don't grasp what's going on, and they end up communicating things that are just not quite accurate. And we'll come back to that theme a number of times. One of the challenges has been the whole conversation about people and the workforce. And there's this narrative that people don't want to work anymore. Everybody is staying home, taking money from the government. Well, okay, that may have been a factor earlier this year, but those programs expired in September, and you still have job opportunities that are going unfilled. So it's got to be more than just people are getting government help. The fact of the matter is we've been dealing with this as a problem for years. You guys certainly have seen it. The shortage of manufacturing workers has been decades in existence. And one of the key issues that people keep forgetting is that boomers are retiring. The boomer generation has dominated the economy from birth. I mean, we have run retail. I mean, it's just the boomers have been the thing, and we still are, because 10,000 boomers retire or reach retirement age every single day. We have been losing 3.5 to 3.7 million workers per year for the last 4 to 5 years, and we will continue to lose that many for the next 4 to 5 years. So that's a lot of people. And as they're coming out of the workforce, that's lowering workforce participation to rates we haven't seen since the 70s. So it's not that people are sitting around doing nothing or living off the dole. They've retired. That's what they're allowed to do at 65. Boomers are even delaying it. You know, they're working into their late 60s and 70s, but eventually they leave the workforce. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go as well. So let's talk about inflation, because among the things that's driving me nuts about the press right now is that they're giving voice to some of these guys that are just hollering idiocies. I mean, I was listening to a guy the other day, he's the founder of Twitter, talking about hyperinflation is inevitable. And I wanted to just look at this guy and say, you know, I understand that the first four letters of Twitter is twit, but do you really have to behave like one? Hyperinflation is 50% inflation per month over several months. Think of the Weimar Republic and the collapse in the 1930s. We are at 5% inflation. So I don't see a 45% increase in inflation in November. It's absurd. We're nowhere near hyperinflation, nor will we be. It is a very rare circumstance, and we're not coming anywhere close to it. Same thing with talk about stagflation. I've heard that come up. Stagflation is double-digit inflation with double-digit levels of unemployment. We're currently at 5% inflation with 4.7% unemployment. Those are not double digits. Stagflation is a circumstance where the economy is not growing at the same time that you get inflation, but we're obviously growing. We were growing very fast earlier in the year. We've now slowed down, but it's not to a critical point by any stretch. So neither one of these are even close to legitimate threats. And when people start spouting off about it, it's like, I just I want to go insane. There's there's a kind of economist that is constantly predicting doom and gloom, and we call these guys stopwatch economists because a stopwatch is right twice a day. You just have to know when to ask. So the stopwatch economist is the guy that predicts the recession every single day, relentlessly, for years. Sooner or later, there will be a recession. And then he can say, I predicted this recession 20 years ago, which you did because you predicted it every day for 20 years. You managed to miss 19 years of growth, but hey, you eventually were right when it came to the recession. You're business people, you understand that you've got to understand every phase of the economy. You don't want to get caught in a recession, don't want to get caught by inflation, but you also don't want to miss the booms where the growth becomes the number one focus for your business. So enough of my ranting. What are we facing as far as inflation? There are three motivators for inflation as a rule. There is commodity inflation, there's wage inflation, and there's money supply. The commodities part is actually indeed transitory. The Fed talks about transitory all the time, and we'll see that in some of the graphs coming up. Commodities go up and down. They spike, and the spike causes a reaction to those prices. The prices then fall, no matter what you're looking at, whether it's steel or lumber or oil, you name it, you see that EKG look every time you look at the graphs. It's up, it's down, it's up again, it's down. They're not consistent. So commodities are always transitory. The question is when? When do they go up? When do they go down? And what do you do while you're waiting for those moments to arrive? The more damaging kind of inflation is wage inflation, because once wages go up, they don't go back down. Obviously, I mean, you can't hire somebody at a price and say, well, you know, things got better, so I'm going to cut your wages by half. Once they're in place, they're in place. Most of the wage hikes that we're seeing so far are with skilled workers, people who've been in short supply. And you've been dealing with this along with all the other manufacturers for a long time. If you want to get the right person for the right job, you're going to have to pay for it. When you recognize that the number one way that manufacturers have recruited workers for the last 10 years has been to poach them from somebody else. You don't have a pipeline, you don't have people coming in from trade schools at a rapid enough clip. There are too many people that don't have the skills you need, so you end up looking for them by looking at your competitors or even those who are in the same business as you. Well, if you're going to recruit somebody by poaching them, well, it's money. You're going to have to pay them more, give them more benefits. The third thing, as far as inflation, which is a little more worrisome, is money supply. There's still $5 trillion in excess savings because of all the stimulus we did in 2020. Used to be 7 to 8 trillion, so it's beginning to come down. The challenge with having this kind of money in circulation is it makes people a little more tolerant of inflation. Even though they complain about the higher prices, they have the money. So they'll go ahead and spend it anyway if they want that product. If they don't have the money, that inflation will inhibit them more because they simply don't have the ability to pay for it. The only kind of inflation the Fed can really impact is money supply. So when they start to mess with interest rates, all they're trying to do is dry up the money supply. They're trying to make it harder to borrow, and they have no real impact on commodities prices. They have no real impact on wages. All they can do is try to control that spigot. And one of the reasons the Fed will raise interest rates, even though inflation is not critical, is that they know it takes a while to dry up that supply. The estimate is that it takes anywhere from a year to a year and a half for a Fed interest rate to really affect the economy. So if they start to move the rates up mid next year or end of next year, they're not really expecting that to have an impact on the economy until 2023. So here's what you can show people are screaming about stagflation and hyperinflation and all the other nonsense. No matter who you talk to, whether it's the IMF or the Fed or any of 1,000 different groups, this is where they're looking at inflation going over the next 5 or 6 years. It's leveling out. It's actually going down in some cases. So it is certainly not heading into the stratosphere. And lots of reasons for that. I mean, a lot of what's been driving inflation of late has simply been the supply chain crisis and the fact that people are having to pay extra to get what they want or pay more to get the people they want. It's fairly temporary and not in an immediate sense. I mean, that's the frustrating thing. You say it's temporary and people say, oh, good. Like, does it go away next week? No, it's temporary as in Q2 or Q3 of next year. So you've got to suffer through 6 or 7 months before it gets any better. Other issues, you mentioned them in the poll. Supply chain has been top of the list. Port congestion is horrible, but there are solutions kind of on the horizon. The biggest challenge that the supply chain's having right now are the shortages of key people. We don't have enough drivers. We don't have enough people working the docks. We don't have enough people working on the container ships. That's kind of the extension of the labor supply issue into the supply chain itself. But to be honest, the supply chain was just taken by surprise, and it's going to take a while for it to settle out and get caught up. Most of the companies that are seeing high demand are gearing up as fast as they can and are doing what they can to meet demand. Take, for example, the chip shortage, which has basically hampered everything in the automotive or vehicle sector. Taiwan Semiconductor is the biggest producer of chips in the world. They're working around the clock. They have 3 shifts growing 24/7, 365. They expect to be caught up by first quarter, second quarter at the latest. And then it's just a matter of getting them to the places that they need. The automotive sector, they've already built the car. The car is ready to roll. I was talking to a guy in the auto sector that said, look, literally the day the chips come in, we put the chip in, the car is done. I mean, that car is 1 second away from being sellable. And this sort of thing is going to accelerate the recovery of the supply chain deterioration. Labor shortages, we've talked that one to death. Major fault lines developing globally. But here's where things get complicated because you look at what's happening with oil. Oil prices have gone up. And the question is why? Because we're not really consuming any more oil than we were a year ago. If anything, we're still stuck in that 2020 consumption pattern because we haven't gone back to commuting. The number one way that we consume oil in this country is through vehicles, and that's commuting. We're not back to work in our normal environment, so we're not commuting. So why is it that oil prices are going up anyway? And it goes back to issues where you're thinking, what the heck does this have to do with us? It is 500 to 600% increases in natural gas prices in Europe. And so people are like, okay, I can see where that would be a problem for the Europeans, but why is that affecting the price I'm paying for gas at the pump? Well, the connections are Europe is having a natural gas crisis because the Russians are being the Russians. You may have noted in the introduction that I was a Soviet and East European studies specialist at one point. That was my chosen career in the 80s. So beneath this placid exterior lives the heart of a cold warrior. I trust the Russians as far as I can throw them. And they're behaving the way they always did back when they were the Soviet Union. I don't believe they've changed one iota. I mean, for crying out loud, the country is being led by a former KGB colonel. I mean, how different do you think they are? They're holding Europe hostage. They want to sell the Europeans, they want to get the Europeans to build them another gas pipeline. The Europeans don't want to build another gas pipeline, so they're balking, and the Russians are withholding gas, trying to force the Europeans to knuckle under and build that pipeline. At the very same time, the Europeans invested in a lot of wind power with the expectation that that was going to replace their need for gas. And it would have if the wind had blown this year, but it didn't. And they're getting 20% of what they expected to get from their wind power. So all of a sudden, the Europeans are in a bind. They don't have enough natural gas. They need more of it than ever before. They had a rough winter last year. So they are snapping up every little bit of LNG that they can get their hands on at the same time that the Asians are doing the same thing because they need that liquid natural gas as well. So the utilities in the United States that were burning LNG now are burning oil because it's cheaper than the LNG. And so the demand for oil suddenly went up because utilities needed it. So the driver is sitting there going, so I'm paying more at the pump for a gallon of gas, even though I'm not driving as much as I used to, because the Russians are threatening the Europeans. The wind is not blowing in Europe, and LNG is now being sold to the European. You know, this is making my head hurt. I just want gas prices to go back down. And they will at some point when all those other issues start to get solved. If the Russians decide to send more gas and if the wind blows, and you get my point. It's becoming a very complicated world. So here's the slide that I hope you all forget and do not remember the next time we speak. These are my predictions for 2022. Remember that my favorite definition of an economist is someone who explains tomorrow why the predictions they made yesterday didn't come true today. So I think our GDP growth will rebound. We're going to be under 5%, which we're heading for this year, but somewhere between 4.5. I'm not terribly worried about the decline in third quarter because I think we'll recover a lot of that in fourth quarter. Inflation at the core rate is going to be around 3%, the real rate probably around 5%, a little higher than we've seen the last few years. Core up till now has been around 2%. Real rate closer to 4, so it's not come up dramatically, but it's come up some. And some sectors are seeing it more aggressively than others, however temporary that may be. The core rate is what the Fed pays attention to when it's considering interest rates. So the interest rates will start to rise by the middle of next year, probably getting up around 1 to 1.5% by the end of the year. Still very low, but a lot higher than 0 to 0.025. So it's going to be something of a shock. And it's the attempt on the part of the Fed to dry up some of that money supply. The most critical thing about the Fed's decision making is that there will be two very ardent hawks participating on the Open Market Committee next year. This year, the Open Market Committee is mostly neutral, but next year you're going to have Loretta Mester from Cleveland and Esther George from Kansas City on that Open Market Committee, and both of them are very hawkish and want to see interest rates come up. This will make other rates move. Mortgage rates will come up at the same time. Given the importance of housing to your sector, this is a consideration. They're not going to skyrocket, but they're going to go up enough that some of those marginal first home buyers are going to be priced out of the market. Nothing really has been favoring housing except mortgage rates. The price of homes has gone up. You've got shortages of workers, shortages of material. The only thing that's been sustaining the housing market has been low mortgage rates. If they start to go up, even though it's going to be fairly minor, it's going to have an impact on at least some of the buyers. Unemployment numbers are going to stay about where they are, somewhere around 4.5 to 5%. But there's a lot of nuances in unemployment. I already talked about the workforce participation thing, but it's important also to note that the numbers that we see whenever we get unemployment data, that's U3. There are 6 different cuts that come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. U3 is the easiest one to collect and the first one to come out, because all it is are people who are formally on unemployment, people who are getting unemployment checks, who are checking in with the unemployment office looking for work. U6 is another cut which picks up workers that U3 doesn't. The U6 number will pick up the so-called discouraged worker. This is the person who is not getting unemployment, is not formally looking for work, but is just as unemployed. And they're looking for an opportunity to come back into the workforce in some capacity. It also picks up the involuntary part-time, people who are looking for a full-time job, all they can find is a part-time job. And one of the challenges we have right now is we're not picking up a lot of people who are working in the informal economy. They're basically working off the books, or they're doing things that are hard to classify. The classic kind of gig economy job is the Uber driver. But you've got a lot of variations on that theme, and a lot of people who are working, but not in a formal sense. The trade deficit is going to worsen as consumers get more aggressive and buy more things. But the good news is that our exports are also rising. They're just not rising as fast as the imports are. We're selling a lot more food overseas. We have a weird trade pattern. We sell food and sophisticated heavy machinery. So we're at both ends of the spectrum when it comes to exports. We export really expensive things and we export soybeans, corn, all that kind of stuff. Most likely there'll be one more surge left as far as the pandemic. We're going into the winter. It's the point of the year when the virus tends to see a gain anyway. I don't know if this is surge number 5 or 73 or who knows. But each surge has been a little less damaging. We've gotten more vaccines. People are better protected than they were. There was a question earlier about the movement towards mandating vaccines. First off, we've done that for years. I mean, mandates are not new. We've been mandating, honest to God, I saw something the other day where the first vaccine type mandate in the history of the United States was when Washington was the general during the Revolutionary War and was demanding that his troops be inoculated against whatever dread disease was going around back then. The real issue for companies is right now they're sort of caught in a bind, because if they mandate and somebody has a bad reaction to the vaccine, then there's the possibility they'll be sued. If they don't mandate, they can also be sued. And this has happened already, where employees said, you are obligated to provide a safe working environment. By not mandating, somebody came to work with COVID and gave it to me, and you didn't require that they be protected. So you are responsible for my getting COVID. And so the company is like, great. If I mandate, I get sued. If I don't mandate, I get sued. And so part of the challenge is to get the government to say, look, you have done in the past kind of protections and exemptions that if you demand that people do something, because you see it with kids all the time, all the vaccines we have to go through as children, there were provisions that said, hey, if you have a bad reaction, well, we'll do our best, but don't turn around and sue the school district. It's a mandate and you don't have the status. So that's going to be the argument in the next few months. So now to graphs. We all need graphs. The surge has been followed by a little bit of decline. Consumers led us out of this mess and now kind of settling back to a more normal process. Consumption on services, consumption on goods generally parallel. It did not for a period of time during the pandemic. If you look at 2020, I mean, we were buying services like mad because we couldn't buy service, or goods because we couldn't buy services. That began to shift back to normal in 2021. the consumption of goods and services drives the domestic economy for a brief period of time. Again, predominantly in 2020, the government role played a bigger part in all this, but that's now beginning to diminish back to more normal numbers. We're seeing a return to normal growth starting next year, looking at stuff like maybe 3 to 4% growth in the first quarter, a little less in the second quarter, a little less in the third quarter, sort of getting back to where we used to be. But 2.5 to 3%, that's been our average for the last 25 years. So it's not like we don't know how to work with it. It's just we haven't seen it the last couple of years. Record farm exports. I know that that's probably not at the top of the list for people in woodworking, but it's good for the US economy because there's an awful lot of money that circulates as a result of this kind of activity in the farm sector. So the forecast is considerably better than it's been in years. And a lot of this is simply because other countries have had bad crop years. We've had pretty decent ones. I live in an agricultural state. And for once, the rains came mostly when we wanted them to and have mostly stayed away when we want them to. So you're getting decent production out of the farm communities, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Iowa, etc. Housing, obviously at the top of your list. It is still growing. It's leveling off a little bit, but I mean, those numbers are really high. It's been growing at a 26% year-over-year rate. We'll continue to do that into 2022. A little bit of a slowdown if mortgage rates go up too high, but a lot of the market has still been the upper end home, and they're not going to be affected by mortgages. The upper end buyer is mostly interested in the performance of the stock market. That's where their money comes from. They're not sitting around going, oh, I don't know, if it goes up to 3.9, I'm not going to do it. It's got to stay at 3.8. I don't care. I mean, if their stocks are performing, they buy the second house or upgrade. The commercial side is beginning to see a bit of a rebound. As recently as 2 months ago, this was down 44%, not down 4. What's driving commercial is warehousing, distribution, not offices. So from the woodworking perspective, the office environment is not yet recovering and probably won't until we start seeing people going back to the office in greater numbers than they are now. So I mentioned earlier the transitory nature of commodities, and there you have it. I mean, this is steel scrap, not something you guys work with particularly, but you know, crucially high increase and followed by a drop and another increase and a drop. It just looks like an EKG. It just constantly up and down. Same thing with structural steel. So when you see the Fed talking about transitory commodity inflation, this is what they look at. They know that sooner or later it's going to come back down. It always does. But they also know that sooner or later it goes back up. It is very responsive to demand. We saw it in your industry with lumber. I mean, that was the story all summer. It's like, my God, look at the lumber prices. Well, yeah, look at them. They're back to where they were. And you have a crisis that is created by excess demand, limited production. COVID affected the sawmills out west. And when they recovered, well, the recovery affected the entire industry. So whenever the Fed looks at stuff like this, they're saying, yes, we know, we definitely see the inflation. We're not blind to this, but we know the pattern. We know where it goes from here. Same thing with oil. Oil prices bounce all over the place as well. They've bounced back up. They're now close to 80 and probably will drift into the mid 80s. But the reality of all of these things is that we're not really short of any of these commodities. When you get real inflationary threats that don't go away, it's when you simply don't have the commodity, period. If you want to think about it in terms of oil, for example, go back to the 1970s and the oil embargo. We had a lot of inflation that was linked to the high price of oil because there was nothing we could do about it. We didn't have any oil. The OPEC nations would not sell it to us, period. So there was a real honest to God shortage that could not be dealt with. Fast forward to today, we have a temporary rise in the price of oil. We're seeing more demand than was expected because of what I talked about before. But the frackers in North Dakota and Texas and Wyoming are like hot dog, man. Prices are $80 a barrel. I'm going into full production. We produce our own oil now. We don't need oil from OPEC. We produce absolutely every bit of oil we need. If we buy anything from overseas, it's just simply because it's easier. If you're an East Coast refiner, it's easier to get it by ship from the Middle East than to punch it through the Colonial Pipeline from the middle of the country. The point is that almost every commodity that we rely on, we control the production to a degree. We've got it. It's just a matter of when people want to produce it. So it's not like there's no steel or no lumber or no copper. It's, well, it's what the demand is going to push those producers to do. And sooner or later, they produce. Mentioned that people were going back to work. It varies a lot per where you are in the country. In Texas, for example, it's up to 50%. California is still around 20%. So it depends where in the world you are, and it depends on what kind of job you have. I'm the economist for no less than 12 state CPA societies. CPAs could care less. They're fine working from home. They don't talk to anybody anyway. If they had their druthers, they would be in the office with no windows, no doors, no opportunity for conversation. They're perfectly happy. Salespeople, however, are going nuts. They have to talk to people. They have to get out there and sell their products. You don't sell the kind of machines that your industry makes with a text message. Hey, got a great machine. Send me $2 million and I'll send it to you. It's more interaction. It's more building relationships. You can't do that remotely. So the estimate is that by the middle of next year, you'll see about 80% of people back to work. That may be a little optimistic because we're still only at about a third, but some parts of the country will more definitely be in that 80% range. So finishing off with a few comments about the supply chain and all that kind of mess. We have a trifecta of distress. We've got transportation problems, warehousing problems, inventory problems. They're all coming up close to maximum distress. I mean, we haven't seen these numbers this high in years and not all at the same time. The load factors are ridiculous. The load to truck ratio is 7.5, 7.5 loads for every single truck in the United States. There's going to be a shortage. There are not enough drivers. There's 80,000 drivers short. We are probably going to be 120,000 drivers short next year. This has caused a lot of creativity when it comes to recruiting. A lot of drivers now from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Serbia, Croatia, other places. I was talking to the Used Truck Association not long ago, and they were commenting that a lot of companies are having to hire translators just so they can sell to the drivers that are coming from Eastern Europe. About a week after that, I was in a truck stop and I heard a bunch of drivers speaking Russian, and it was like, hey, so you guys are Russian truck drivers? Duh. How come so many Russian truck drivers? And they said, well, we are Russian. We have Russian wives. We want to be on road as much as possible. So you've got a kind of a cultural shift almost as far as transportation is concerned. This is a little bit of an eye chart. Just want to point out one thing, and that is the solid green line in Q2 of next year. 2022 is going to start out pretty good, and particularly for manufacturing, all the way down the line, whether it's automotive, aerospace, primary metals, you name it. It gets progressively less robust as time goes on. So by the time you get to the end of 2022, you sort of see a dip appear, and that's a little bit more obvious in the line graph. So you get a good recovery, it dips, then it kind of comes back. The latest version of this is a study that my company does. And for those of you who are real data geeks and just can't live without this kind of stuff, I will be more than happy to send this to you. It's like 35 pages long. We've been developing it for the last year, and it very accurately describes what's happening with manufacturing as a whole. On a month-to-month basis, we're getting like 96% accuracy. So as you can see, we're getting growth, but then it tapers off. The latest version doesn't have the recovery quite as robust towards the end of next year as we originally thought. A little more obvious on a long-term graph. We got good recovery. We're now doing kind of the second wave of decline before we come back. And this is kind of the dip that we all experienced earlier this year. This is the credit managers index. I talked earlier about how the indices were performing relatively well. The purchasing managers index and the credit managers index are both good tools because they're honest and they're current. They come out every month. The PMI was the first of them. The CMI basically copied a lot of the PMI because I run the CMI and it was just easier to copy them to invent something new. So the power of both of these is that you are asking questions of people that are easily answered. You're basically saying, are you seeing more or less or the same? So you ask a purchasing manager, are you buying more or less steel? More. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make. I'm the purchasing manager. I don't have any idea why I'm buying all this stuff. I'm just told to buy it. They told me we were out of toilet paper and I'm going to buy some. So it's just accurate. It just is. They're not fudging it. They're just reporting on what they're doing. The credit manager get asked, are you seeing more accounts out for collection or fewer? More. How come? Because they're not paying us. You do know how this works, don't you? I don't know why they're not paying us. Maybe they're jerks. Maybe we're jerks. I don't know. They're just not paying me. So you end up with good, accurate data that'll let you track month to month. And it's simple. Anything over 50 is indicating growth. Anything under 50 indicates contraction. Both of these indices have been in the upper and mid 50s or even 60s. Some of the CMI data has been close to 70. So these numbers are all very strong and going into the coming year in a position of robust growth. So I said I was going to end with something optimistic and it will have an impact on your industry as well as many others. All of these supply chain issues are convincing people that they need to come home. You're looking at about 46% reporting that they plan to relocate both manufacturing and sourcing, and 37% of those saying they're going to move back to the US. We're looking at almost $1 trillion of reshoring activity coming to the US next year. And you look at further polls like this one, 69% likely, very likely, or extremely likely to reshore. As I was hitting all these manufacturing shows this week, I was asking people, is this true? Are you really planning to do this? And most of them said, we're not planning, we're doing it. We are fed up with trying to deal with overseas suppliers. We can't rely on them anymore. It's gotten expensive. Transportation costs keep going up. The fact that we can now produce in the United States and do it with robotics and technology and automation has lowered the price. We're more competitive and companies are shifting things back. Remember about 20, 30 years ago, the norm for companies was to control as much of their process as they could. And then all of a sudden, the management theory said, nope, that's not efficient. You should stick to your core competency and outsource everything else. That works as long as those outsource solutions are reliable, as long as you've got suppliers you can count on. Last few years, that has not been the case. And all of a sudden, companies are like, why don't we bring this stuff back in-house again? I was talking to a guy out in Western Kansas who manufactures tanks, things for the agricultural sector. Been doing it for years. The guy's 94 years old. And he said, you know, I used to make everything that went on that tank. And somebody talked me into outsourcing it. So here I sit. I've got almost 1,000 tanks sitting in my storage yard, ready to go, but I don't have valves for them because I'm importing the valves from China. I'm never going to do that again. I may be 94 years old, but I'm changing the rules. We are now going to go back to producing our own valves, and we're going to produce everything else we need for that tank. I don't want to be on somebody's list of supply chain targets. I'm wanting to take control. That conversation is happening a lot now. You know, it's not going to mean an instant change, but people are beginning to say, what can I take control of again? You know, that's not going to mess me up too much financially, but gives me more control over my supply chain. So with that, I'm going to shut up and take questions. And I couldn't resist this. I saw this the other day and I thought how accurate that is for me. Had the same toolbox for 20 years, still opened the wrong drawer every time. Even though I put the thing back where it's supposed to be, I never remember where that is. So with that, I'm going to hush, and I think Adria is going to field questions for me, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a ton of super interesting information, as always. So please, folks, if you have any questions for Chris, if you want to elaborate on anything that came up, go ahead and throw it in the chat, and we can raise that for everybody. We did get a couple in advance. So Chris, you talked about transportation, and certainly workforce is a big factor. Is there something, the port issue, is certainly its own whole thing. And it seems like a confluence of factors, the worker shortage, but what else is going on with the ports? Is it COVID sanitation stuff, lack of containers, barriers from coming in from other countries? Like, what's going on there?
Short answer is yes, all of the above. The ports have become kind of a focus of the bottleneck. You saw where Biden tried to do something about it and demand that the ports be open 24/7. It doesn't really help because all it really did was shift the freight from the ships onto the port itself. So it's still stacked up. They're still not moving anywhere because there's not enough trucks working the ports to get them to where they need to go. There's not enough space in the break bulk facilities. We overwhelmed the system. We've had more stuff coming in than ever. Remember that chart where we suddenly went from buying services to buying things? Well, we bought a lot of things and it clogged up the system. But you're looking at an older workforce in the ports. You don't have enough people, as you already pointed out. You don't have enough drivers. You don't have enough people working the ships themselves. There's 1.3 million seafarers in the world. 900,000 of them are from emerging market nations. Most of them have not been able to get a vaccine, which means they can't get off the ship. So when they're arriving in various ports, they're stuck. So what they used to do was work about a month or two as far as a voyage. Now they're being told they're going to be on that ship for 200 days. And all of a sudden they're like, no, I'm not going to work 200 straight days on a container ship. So they're quitting at a rather prodigious rate. There was a conversation I was noticing in one of the publications you sent out that people were looking at alternative ports and looking for places that were not as congested. Well, that was a really good idea for about 3 weeks. And then all of a sudden, those ports got congested. So it's kind of like, we're familiar with this. The highway is crowded. I think I'll take that highway. But so is everybody else. Now that highway is crowded. Okay, now I'm going to try this highway. Okay, so is everybody else. And now they're all crowded. So, we're all facing the same issue. One thing that's developing in the not distant future that may change a lot of supply chain, Canadian Pacific Railroad is buying Kansas City Southern. Kansas City Southern is the smallest of the class ones, but it has the best penetration into Mexico. What Canadian Pacific wants to do is divert as much as 40% of the freight that's coming into the west coast of the US to ports in Vancouver and Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico, rail it to the middle of the United States and Canada, and do the break bulk in the middle. So you'll end up with a tremendous, the estimates have been anywhere from 500,000 to 800,000 containers a day coming into the middle of the United States rather than the coasts. That changes a lot of dynamics for a supply chain. Doesn't end the problem. You're still going to have to find trucks and drivers and all the rest of that stuff, but it takes some of that congestion away from the West Coast. We've already seen shippers going through the canal and going into ports on the East Coast and the Gulf, but it's just we still overwhelm the system.
Yeah, wow. Well, hopefully that will help things out a little bit. This one, I'm not sure if you have any insight on CARB, the California Air Resources Board. That's a big factor for us. A lot of us are on the West Coast, and CARB influences a lot of what EPA does related to our
Right.
regulation. So do you know anything about the CARB air requirements and how that impacts the movement of goods from the ports?
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation about what one does to control whatever the issues are, whether it's air pollution or climate change or any of the other priorities that are set by government. And it complicates things at the most basic level because you'll have different rules for different parts of the country. And there's already been concern that the new rules about how the ports are to be run is going to have an impact on how well they can handle the onslaught. Another reason to push things to Lazaro and to Vancouver. The ideas are never necessarily bad, but one of the challenges of economics in general is the law of unintended consequences. You say that I'm going to do this because that's an important thing to do, but economics is like pulling a string on a sweater. Once you start to do something, it ripples through the entire economy. So if you change the way things are done at the port, then it changes the financial dynamics, which bends to shift people to a different solution. The auto sector has already been dealing with the fact that they have to have a different kind of fuel. In California, California fuel prices will be higher because only a few refineries can produce that kind of gas. It just, and even in the construction side of things, I was listening to home builders saying, well, we have these dual mandates. We have the mandate number one, which is we're supposed to put electric charging stations in every new house that we build. At the same time, we're supposed to be building affordable housing. Well, putting in a charging station makes the house more expensive. So if we're going to produce a low income house and have a charging station, something else is going to have to go. It's either going to have to be a smaller house, maybe it's a house with no bathroom. Maybe instead of a kitchen, you have a camp stove in the back. It's like, which do you want more? Do you want the low income house? Because chances are the low income home builder buyer isn't charging their Tesla in their house. I mean, so it's just, it's really difficult to solve all these problems at once. And even going back to the Europeans had the perfect solution to get away from Russian natural gas, use wind power. Too bad the wind didn't blow. So suddenly they're like, that didn't work so well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Good point. So, okay, we have 3 really good questions. We have a lot of great questions, but we're running short on time. See if we can fit these in, maybe rapid fire style. So the first one is, will fracking start growing anytime soon?
So it already has, and it's going to grow at an accelerated rate, probably 2 to 3 times what it was even 4 months ago.
Okay. Will middle income housing slow down, change, raise or lower prices in the market?
Middle income housing probably won't change a lot. The biggest change is going to be at the lower end because they'll be the most sensitive to mortgage rates. Upper end is not going to change at all unless the stock market changes. So the middle level is probably going to continue to grow simply because millennials are thoroughly into the market now. And you're also seeing more kind of exodus from the larger cities, partly in reaction to what's been going on with COVID. So middle income should be pretty solid.
All right. That's good to know. And the third one is not conducive at all to rapid fire. But how are we going to fix the labor issue?
Well, in a way, it is fairly conducive because there's only 2 ways. You're either going to have to train people or bring people in from other parts of the world. And we've been a little reluctant to do either one. We do a lot of educating, but we don't do it with a purpose. And one of the challenges is trying to get the education system to recognize what we need people to do instead of, I mean, last year we graduated 10,000 people with degrees in film criticism. So, do we really need 10,000 new film critics, or do we need people who can work in woodworking or something else in manufacturing? On the other hand, we can also look to immigration. However, we don't want to necessarily open the borders to people without skills. That's not going to help. We're trying to recruit people with skills to come to the United States, but so is everybody else. So it's not an easy solution. It's a simple one, train people better and bring people in from outside. Not so easy to actually do.
Yes, as we know, the implementation takes a lot of time and commitment and energy, and we're going to keep chipping away at it and keep, it's definitely a priority. Well, thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate you sharing your time and your insight and information with us today.
And if you have people that had other questions, feel free to send them to me later, or they can send them to me. My address is on all the slides, so I have no problem answering these things privately. You can call me for that matter. So just follow up and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Chris. And we are sharing the recording. Are you okay with us sharing the slides as
Oh,
well?
yeah, absolutely. You
Okay.
bet.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. We hope it was informative. Please complete the survey and be on the lookout for that recording link. Angelo, do you have any parting words?
No, I just want to thank Chris, and hopefully I'm looking forward to some follow-up webinars in the future, and we'll see how good you are at your predictions.
Very good. And I have to point out before we leave that just for you guys, I wore my Halloween tie. So, just to let you know that I'm seasonal, I get it. So.
Oh, I thought you were just a Cleveland Browns fan. Maybe I'm mistaken there.
No, it's got little pumpkins on it, so I'm good. So.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.